Good morning. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me once again. I really appreciate it. I have some stories to tell this morning to talk about family, and I didn't tease out those exact principles like I usually do, so thank you for intuiting that. Excellent job. Before my father passed away a few years ago, he built a clock, and I know some of you have heard this story, or parts of it anyway. The clock, and in my speech I've got it capitalized, the clock. It's become very much a part of my story now, and you'll see why. It's a giant contraption. It is 8 feet long. It is more than 3 feet tall. It's a mass of exposed gears made of burnished aluminum and some wood trim for the hours and the minutes. There's a 6-foot pendulum on the right-hand side, your right-hand side, that offsets a cylindrical counterweight on that faraway left end. It's an object the size and shape of a coffee can, fashioned of intricately joined bits of wood and filled with 10 pounds of lead as the counterweight. And when my dad passed, the clock was in his basement workshop, mounted on a temporary stand of 2x4s on casters, so he could roll it out of the way when there was more pressing projects that came up in the wood shop. And because the clock, you see, was not quite finished, it ran, it just didn't keep time very well. Something still needed adjusting within its dozen or so handmade gears. My dad built this clock. Good morning. And no two of these gears are the same. My mother says she could always tell when my dad was working on the clock because she could hear it ticking from the living room upstairs. Well, it's a ginormous metal clock. We had to make a special trip back up to Michigan to get the clock because as soon as my mother said, "What am I going to do with my clock, with your father's clock?" I said, "I'll take it." And at that point, I hadn't even seen the clock. And when I saw the clock, I said, "Oh, I'm definitely taking the clock." We rented the biggest van we could get from the airport in Detroit. We wrapped the clock in every blanket that my mom could spare, and we drove back to Florida. It's a 2-day trip from my parents' house here. And we did this last August. We went to Michigan. The clock, since then, has been leaning against the wall in an adjacent room, waiting for its grand installation in my living room. I have this big cathedral ceiling, so there's this perfect spot above the couch it could go on. We needed to paint the wall, though, because, of course, once the clock was on the wall, we weren't ever going to take that clock back down to paint the wall, so then there was that big conversation about what color are we going to paint the wall, and I don't know, are we going to paint the whole room, or are we just going to paint that wall? We painted that one wall. My husband decided he was going to fabricate some custom-made brackets to mount this thing. The temporary brackets my dad had on were just these, he literally took a 2x4 and just like carved the edges out because it's got hooks, these fancy hooks that it hangs on. They're not just, they're rounded hooks. Dad had just carved some pieces out of 2x4, so my husband had to make something special, and he took the pattern from the CAD diagrams off my dad's computer and recreated the gears in wood so what's mounted to the wall looks like it's part of the clock, but it also supports the clock. And of course, we had to go through 2 sheets of plywood to figure out how to make that work. He made the brackets to account for the weight and the specialness of the clock. And each weekend since last August, when I would call my mother to check on her and have our little family conversation, she would ask, "Is the clock on the wall yet?" And each weekend, the answer was, "No, not yet." But 2 weekends ago, we installed the clock. We got up on Sunday morning and said, "Today is the day." The wall had been painted. The brackets were finally ready. We had bought almost every size toggle bolt you could buy from Lowe's in multiples because we did not want to stop in the middle to make that infamous second trip to Lowe's in the middle of the project. On top of that, my stepson's rock band was rehearsing in our studio, so we had 3 young men with strong backs to be on hand to help with the lifting of this thing. It's 8 feet long and 3 feet tall. And about 9 o'clock Sunday night, I texted my mom a picture of the clock on the wall and said, "Look, we finally did it." And she wrote back, "I knew you could get it done, and happy early Mother's Day." And I had completely forgotten that the next Sunday, last Sunday now, was Mother's Day. No. And here we are now, precipitously close to June, as I keep being reminded by my calendar. And my mom has planned one last yard sale to dispense of the last of my dad's tools and equipment that the family hasn't already absorbed or my mom hasn't already sold. And I'm not sure that she did it intentionally, but she's planned it for Father's Day weekend. And I've been thinking about mothers and fathers and family a lot lately. My sister lives close to my mom, about 15 miles away, and she has shouldered the majority of the burden of my mom's transition since my dad's death, on top of dealing with her own grief just because of her physical proximity. And as I've talked to friends and heard about their experiences with their moms and dads and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins, I find myself marveling at the incredible strength that we draw from our families through both the good times and the bad times. And family, in its ideal form, is a sanctuary of love and support and belonging. Family is where we first learn to trust. It's where we form our additional identity of who we are, how we figure out how we fit into the world, even if that world at the time is just what's within the four walls of your own house. When a family works well, they teach each other how to care for one another. They encourage each other, and they bring their best selves forward. How many of us can say, however, that our family sounds like that? And I had a line initially in there about Disney family, but then I thought about Disney, and I thought about, Snow White's stepmom tried to poison her with an apple, and Ariel's dad banished her, and I thought Disney's probably not the role model for family, so take that out. But in reality, they're people. They're inconsistent, they're stubborn, they're short-sighted, they're ill-tempered, they're racist, they're sexist, they're undereducated or overeducated, they're afraid, they're emotionally distant, and lots of us have even been hurt by their own families. So family in its actual form is more often a hodgepodge of love and patience and discomfort and tolerance and a whole lot of hope. Some people have a brother that's a jerk, mostly just because he's your brother, and he's going to be a jerk because he's your brother, but some people's brothers are really, truly despicable people in their own right, and we shouldn't give the title brother more weight than it deserves. And as an example of this, I worked as a 911 dispatcher for a little while in Jacksonville Beach. Horrible job. I am so happy there are people who like to do this work and do it. Hard work. I was remarking to one of my fellow dispatchers one night that I thought it was sad that we had a small number of senior citizens that would routinely call the police for help. They would dial 911 and ask for help, but not because there was a crisis going on, but because they literally had nobody else to call. We had one little old lady, the nicest person. She never understood you shouldn't call 911 for this, but she would call and ask if there was an officer nearby who could come and help her open a jar. And some of these calls were because these folks had a lessened mental capacity. They were dealing with the onslaughts of age. But to me, it was still just sad. It was just unfortunate. And I made the comment to my fellow dispatcher, I would never let my mom or my brother or a family member come to that state, that they wouldn't be alone in calling 911 to open a jar of pickles. And my fellow dispatcher said something that stuck with me forever. He said, maybe it's their own fault. This nice little lady needs a jar open. He said, maybe they were really awful people. Maybe that's an abusive mother. Maybe that guy was a neglectful father. And this is the end result of that. And I hadn't thought of that before. I'm fortunate that my family is mostly normal. Nobody's ever run for office or been convicted of operating a pyramid scheme. I got an uncle that speaks Klingon. I've got an aunt that was a corporate lawyer, but we've all got dark horses in our families, right? And this year for Mother's Day, my mom was insistent about not getting any gifts. I think that's directly tied to the yard sale that's coming up. She's downsizing. She was just happy to see the clock on the wall. She asked for more pictures. The one I sent her obviously was 9 o'clock at night, not great lighting. She wanted to see one with the curtains open and the sunshine on it. And that weekend, it was warm enough in Michigan that my brother-in-law could cook out. So he grilled steaks for my mom and my sister, who has a kid, and his own mother lives about 10 miles down the road the other direction. And they all enjoyed lunch al fresco out on their patio, and they had a delicious chocolatey dessert that I heard all about. And we all know the founder of Mother's Day had no intention of turning that into like a Hallmark holiday. We're not supposed to go buy a ton of crap for your mom on Mother's Day. And I applaud those early efforts by women and for women to get all the mothers together in an effort to restore peace. And this was an effort after the Civil War and to ensure peace going forward. Because I can't imagine the horror of having to send your children off to war. I myself went off to war. I would never do that to my kids. Was pro-Army, still pro-Army, but I don't ever want anybody to have to go through that. But I believe that no matter how progressive as a society we become, I don't think we'll ever be able to replace the immense power and influence that a nurturing mother can provide. And I read the entire transcript of Elizabeth Butker's son's commencement speech. And if you're not sure who that is, he's the football player who's been in the news recently. Sorry, he's not a football player, he's just a kicker. Oh, barely. And I don't even know anything about football, so. He told the women in a college graduation, he's sure they're all excited about their next big achievement, which is going to become a wife and a mother, that they as women have been told diabolical lies and will realize their greatest satisfaction when they lean into their true vocation. And I refuse to call him by his name. He can be known by his mother's title if he's going to talk to people like that. Anyway, while he's entirely entitled to his small-minded and patriarchal opinion, there are a lot of people, men and women, who agree with him, at least in part, that motherhood can be an amazing thing. However, and I put my disclaimer in all caps and blinking lights, that is a decision to be made by the potential mother and not some overpaid, glorified athlete with wealth and privilege afforded to very few. There was a very interesting TikTok reel recently talking about how his experience of parenthood, because of his wealth and his access to support, is very different from the people who watch him play on Sunday, who don't have that access, who parent 24/7 and don't have a nanny or somebody to take over duties when they get tired. And I hadn't thought of that before either. But Elizabeth Butker's son's worldview is entirely warped by the Christian conservative religion that he subscribes to. But on the other hand, as Unitarian Universalists, we know that motherhood can transcend biological ties. We recognize that motherhood can be found in the hearts of adoptive mothers, stepmothers, and guardians, and those who choose to mother through mentorship and guidance. I guess those would be adopted mothers. I'll adopt you as my mom. And the neat thing about this little commencement speech is that people were so quick to point out that Elizabeth is a medical physicist working in Emory University's Department of Radiation Oncology since like 1990 something. She's a really smart lady with a pretty hefty amount of education. So I guess she didn't drink the same Kool-Aid that her son did. On the other hand, I had to dig to find information about her husband. His dad's a finance professional working for a company called MD Keller, which is a company his son founded after he joined the NFL. There is an interesting parallel here, although maybe it's just a coincidence. In the same way, I knew about the history of Mother's Day, something I don't remember specifically learning, but obviously I was taught. It was information that was right here, and I've always been. But in the same way, I had to go find information about Elizabeth Butker's husband. I realized I didn't know anything about the history of Father's Day. Does anybody know his origins? We've all heard about Mother's Day, right? You're going to know.
No, I'm just going to say, because the fathers didn't have a day, and somebody felt badly, so I was going to go.
So, I stole this, Hallmark holiday. This came off the web from the Today Show's webpage. The inspiration for a day dedicated to dads goes back to the early 1900s, which is 100 years or so after Mother's Day. After a woman named Sonora Smart Dodd's mother died during childbirth, she and her siblings were raised by her father, a Civil War veteran named William Smart. To express her gratitude for all her father did for her, Dodd initiated a day designated to, quote, instill the same love and reverence for the father as is the mother's portion. And Dodd wrote about the day in a 1910 newspaper article. At her urging, the very first Father's Day was celebrated on June 19th of the same year, 1910. It's no coincidence Father's Day is celebrated in June, since Dodd chose the date based on the month of her father's birthday. And over the years, various presidents like Calvin Coolidge and Lyndon B. Johnson commemorated the day. But it wasn't until President Richard Nixon signed a proclamation in 1972 that Father's Day became an official holiday on the calendar. And I didn't know that. I just assumed it'd been around longer than Mother's Day. So I will intentionally repeat myself here. No matter how progressive as a society we become, I don't know that we will ever replace the immense power and influence that a nurturing father can provide. And I was fortunate that my dad was present in my life in the form of a traditional husband, wife, children family that remained intact until his death. I know that not everyone had that same experience. In middle school, I had a friend named Sissy Stevens. And Sissy's house was literally the epicenter of chaos. She had an innumerable amount of brothers and sisters. It was never the same kids in the house 2 times in a row. The doors to her house were never closed, never mind locked. Parental guidance was minimal. Her mom was usually the only adult in the house, although for long periods of time, I'm not sure even she was home. Her dad was never there, but sometimes you would meet an uncle. And if you went and spent the night at Sissy's house, there was no bedtime. There was no adult shushing you and telling you it's time to settle down and go to sleep, like at the other kids' houses. There was also frequently no dinner. And it was not uncommon for us to make Jiffy Pop over the open gas flame on the stove. Of course, this was kind of before microwaves, but there wasn't a mom standing there to make sure we didn't actually set anything on fire. And I remember my mom sending me to Sissy's house with a pack of hot dogs and a bag of buns and saying, oh, it's for everybody to share. As an adult, I can look back and realize that while Sissy's house as a kid was a lot of fun, it was a really hard life for everybody in that house. And Sissy moved away after 6th grade, and I've always hoped that everything turned out okay for her. As a kid, it seemed like the dream life. But as an adult looking back, I realize that probably wasn't so great. And as much as not having a father in Sissy's life may have contributed to all that chaos, I'm sure it did, my friend David had the opposite problem. His stepdad, who was the only dad he'd known, was a man's man, a beer-drinking, deer-hunting truck driver. David was an effeminate, math-loving trumpet player who loved his Volkswagen Beetle and letting the girls paint his nails during home ec. His stepdad bullied him ruthlessly. When David finally realized he was gay, which is about a year after all the rest of us figured it out, his stepdad suggested the world would be better off without him, and David tried. Thankfully, he failed, and David and I are still Facebook friends today, and he's doing fabulously, as he would tell me. And it's hard to be a good parent, mom or dad. And we tend to look to dads for strength and guidance and protection, but dads are people too. If he didn't get that when he was becoming an adult, how can we reasonably expect him to duplicate that experience for his children, biological or otherwise? It takes a great deal of personal insight to make conscious decisions regarding behavior that's truly ingrained in us. And we note that fatherhood, too, extends beyond biology. We recognize the significance of fathers who come into our lives through adoption, stepfathers, and those who choose to father through acts of love and support. And the part about making those conscious decisions, one of the most insightful bits of parenting I ever got was from my dad. We lived in Detroit as children. My mom and dad were born and raised there, and they thought it was the greatest city in the world. They were brokenhearted when the financial collapse happened and Detroit basically caved in on itself. And we moved to a very small rural farming community the year before I started kindergarten. And my dad's explanation for that was the crime had gotten too bad in Detroit. Our house was broken into on a Saturday afternoon when the family was gone grocery shopping. And I remember coming home and the screen door off the hinges and the television gone and my mother being very upset. But we spent a lot of time in the city. We went to all the museums. We went back for concerts. We went to Chicago to see museums. And my dad's argument was that just because we lived in the middle of nowhere was no reason to not be an educated, cultured person. And him and my mother had made the conscious decision to remove us from the bad parts, but to make sure we stayed in contact with the good parts. And I never realized as a child that was intentional. No clue. Boop. Wish they'd told me that when my kids were this big instead of this big, but everything worked out fine. And all of us in this room have seen parents that were great and parents that were terrible and all points in between. And one of the beautiful parts of our faith is that we embrace the concept of a chosen family. There are connections that we forge with individuals who become our loving and supportive kin, regardless of blood ties. Chosen family can be formed through deep friendships, through partnerships, and whole communities. They're a testament to the power of the human connection and the unconditional love we share beyond a traditional family structure. In Unitarian Universalism, we affirm that families are not solely determined by blood ties, but are also formed through those deep connections of choice and conscious love. And we celebrate the essence of these families, recognizing that it extends beyond traditional definitions. Because remember, family in its ideal form is a sanctuary of love, support, and belonging. And we come to church, what do we come into? We come into the sanctuary. And because those are definitions, those not part of that sanctuary don't get to decide what those definitions are. And when we expand the definition, we form a wider circle. We build a community that reinforces our values. And just as importantly, as you use, we celebrate the diversity that exists within families. We recognize and we honor the vast array of family structures, including single-parent households, same-sex parents, blended families, multi-generational households. I am so excited. My daughter-in-law, her grandmother is still alive. She'll be 94 in October. The woman still insists on moving her couch once a week to vacuum underneath it, despite the fact that she lives alone she has a little dog, no pets. But at some point, they call her Granny Joyce. She is my grandkids' great-great-grandmother. They are converting the playroom into great-great-grandma's bedroom because great-great-grandma's going to move in with them. And I am so excited to see that dynamic at work. So she's Granny Joyce, I'm Granny Jenny, although I'm just a single grandma. She's great-great-grandma. So maybe I'm almost as good as she is. But multi-generational households, I'm really looking forward to that. And then hopefully, when I need care, I'm just going to move in with them because they'll be used to it, right? I'm going to cheer for this one. So there's no wrong way to be a family. And I think that's a really strong statement that as you use, we make. There's no wrong way to family. It's through embracing the diverse family dynamics that we create a more inclusive and compassionate society. So in closing, let us remember that family is not defined just by birth, but by the bonds of love that we choose to cultivate through our lives. And as we celebrate Mother's Day, and as we go forward into Father's Day, let us honor all of those who have nurtured us and guided us and loved us unconditionally. And may we embrace the beauty of chosen families, recognizing the richness that comes from those diverse connections. In our commitment to Unitarian Universalism, may we continue to foster an environment where all families feel seen and valued and celebrated. May the love we share within our families extend outward, creating a world that embraces and cherishes the beauty of every individual and their unique journey of family. May we build the family we wish each person to have. May it be so.